All right, good morning. We live in extraordinary days. They are extraordinary. They are not run-of-the-mill. I know you're feeling it too. For me, you think back to the earthquake in Nepal that killed so many. You think about the recent terrorist attacks in Tunisia, where 38 people were killed this past week. These are not normal days that we live in. And we could keep going, right? With all sorts of descriptions of things, both good and bad. We live in extraordinary days. There's part of us that aches for the normal, that aches for regular, that aches for something boring, that just would like, can we just do this for a while? But we don't live in days that are very flat right now. We live in extraordinary days. Even this week, just things that were a bit unsettling. Early in the week, the news that Julian Tavigin had to step down for his moral failure. Julian's the grandson of Billy Graham, who was a senior pastor of a large church in South Florida. And it came out that his wife had not only had an affair, but then his reaction was to have one of his own. It doesn't play well, right? I mean, it doesn't really help anybody. Early in the week, and reportedly, the Pope Francis had made some really odd statements of equating Jesus and Muhammad and Allah and Jehovah as the same entity and headed in the same direction, saying the same thing. And that the scriptures, the holy scriptures of the Bible, are the same and equal to the scriptures of the Quran. These are strange days. When he called for peace and unity among all of them, calling for peace, which sounds so much like what happens in Revelation and other places of calling for peace at all costs. And we understand the desire for peace, don't we? The violence and the hurt. I mean, just the things in America that are happening, the racial divisions, the other things happening in our nation are huge. Then this week, obviously, the Supreme Court decision was like an earthquake. And America changed on Friday, just so you know, it changed. I know, I don't want to overstate it, but officially and institutionally, America took a new stance. America changed. Now, I don't want to make too big a statement about it. We'll cover it and get more significant later, but we live in extraordinary days. And I think we live in days where we are going to have to stand strong. And we're not going to need to stand stupid. We need to stand strong. It's going to take a lot of the kind of qualities that we've seen in the lives of Daniel and Meshach and Shadrach and Abednego. The three amigos. And we're going to have to really do some things a lot like them. Not only standing strong, but being wise and prudent, very discerning, very honest. We're going to really have to be a lot like Jesus, I think. In John 1:14, it says that Jesus was full of it. Just so you know, he says he was full of it. And he was full of grace and truth, always in perfect combination. With every person he ever interacted with. Exactly. Now, as you look at it, Jesus interacted very differently with different people, right? I mean, there were some, he was incredibly hard, challenging, almost harsh in the way he approached them. And there are others that we would have expected him to be harsh with, that he wasn't at all. The first thing that he did with them was to affirm their humanity. Remember the lady at the well, John chapter 4? The lady at the well who was a Samaritan woman, those are two strikes against her, at least in that culture. And then she was also a very immoral woman. And what's the very first thing he does is he asks her for help. He affirms her humanity. He says, we're together here. And then he walks through very carefully and gently her life. And eventually she finds hope and life in that whole thing. So, and then the religious bigots of his day, he was harsh on. He said, you're like whitewashed tombs with dead bones in them. And you look great on the outside. And on the inside, you're dead and you're rotten. It was pretty harsh things to say, you know. But he was full of grace and truth all at one time, perfectly combined for the need of the day or of the hour. And I think we're going to have to be a lot like Jesus, having truth and grace combined perfectly at the same time. It's not going to be easy, but I think in the midst of it, we're going to need to stand strong. So I wonder if the book of Daniel, some of the things we've been looking at, maybe do have really apropos for what we're trying to do in life. So we're going to just kind of jump right back into that and see what it has to say to us today. So today we're going to be in the 4th chapter of Daniel, but let me just bring you up to speed real quickly. I love review, probably sometimes a little bit too much review, but I love review. But here we go. So we got to ask the question, where does the book of Daniel fit in the scheme of things? Just so you know, he fits in about the year 600 BC. That's after the heyday of Israel, after their highlights, after their time of great conquest and of great power, and now they've been sent into exile. From here, they're never again will the nation of Israel have a homeland, except for a very short time just before the coming of Christ, but not until 1948 when it becomes a nation again. But they're in captivity in Babylon, and they are utilizing some of these captured Jewish young men to kind of train them up in the ways of Babylon. And so that's what's happening here, but Daniel doesn't really get conform to that. He's different. And along with the three amigos. And if you're new this morning, we'll bring you up to speed on the three amigos here in a second. So then we have to ask the question, well, where does the book of Daniel, what's it all about? And it's all about this, that God is sovereign over history and empires. He really is sovereign over history and empires. Doesn't mean that he endorses everybody, but he is sovereign. And he is working his plan in a very unique way, setting up and removing kings as he pleases. And many of them don't even know him, don't love him. But he is working something going on. And so he's using the Babylonians to discipline the nation of Israel in order to draw them back to himself. And that's what's kind of going on. And all the kingdoms of the world will come to an end, and it will be replaced by the Lord's kingdom someday, which will never pass away. That's coming. So chapters 1 through 6, where we've been this last little while, and we still are, is all about Daniel and his three friends in the Babylonian court and how they handle themselves there and how they live faithfully to the Lord while living in a culture whose value system is diametrically opposed to theirs. Sound like what you felt this past week? That it's opposed to our own, and as a result, they were bringing blessing to the Gentile. Wow, it turns it upside down, doesn't it? You know, and it's like somehow to use this to be a blessing to those who are Gentiles, who don't know God. And it sounds so strange, but God's going to use them in the midst of this. Okay, then, and it's really, I think this theme really will serve us well, is the things that we're dealing with in our culture and what we're wrestling with in an upside-down value system of the contemporary world. So, we're not going to get there on this particular series, but then chapters 7 through 11 are all about Daniel, the visions he had that are eschatological in nature. In other words, the visions he had then that still apply today is to the end of the world and what's going to happen in that, to the last days. You combine Daniel with Revelation, and you have a very clear, begin to get a clarity about what God is doing and how it's going, where it kind of goes from here. And so we're not going to cover those chapters right now, but just so you know, that's there. So, real quickly, chapter 1 is all about your identity as a core issue of your whole life. Sounds like this. Who you be will determine what you do. Your identity determines what you do. Your convictions stand strong as a testimony because what you do proclaims what you believe. And then your testimony will excel in the marketplace because what you believe will speak clearly to the world. Then in chapter 2, we talked about this. We talked about Nebuchadnezzar's dream in the fact that he was a leader that led out of his own insecurities and fear, and it really actually was destructive to people. And it's pathetic when leaders lead that way. Daniel's response was basically that faith is grounded in the ability of God. Not his own ability, but what God could really do. And then Daniel's interpretation of the dream is that God's ability is grounded in himself, that God in himself is able to do this, and we can trust him with it. And that God himself is someone who is worthy for us to honor and to praise, to give beauty to out of our own souls. So then last week we talked about the 6 stages of spiritual battle, which I think just were totally apropos to this week. And here's what it kind of sounds like or looks like. That in this world, we will be asked to conform to the norms of the culture around us. And if we don't, we will be accused. You will be accused of being bigoted, narrow-minded, stupid, judgmental, right? You will be if you stand to that. And so you'll be asked to conform, and if you don't, you will be accused of violating something core to our culture. And if you confirm your stance, you will face contempt. You will face contempt from those around you. But the interesting thing is that if we stand strong, there will be some who will be transformed. And there will be the truth and the grace of God will be promoted by the very people who are against it. Because at the end of the day, here's the deal. Every place else besides walking with God is a dead-end road. And the dead-end road is not very fun. And here's the deal, that sin has never satisfied the human soul. It has never actually satisfied the human soul. And so what we think we wanted so badly ends up being the very thing we hate. It's amazing. When I was in high school, I thought I wanted this pair of saddle shoes so badly. And I told my mom and my dad, I really want that pair of shoes. And it was a nice pair of shoes. It cost then over $100. And they said, no. I said, then I'll make the money and buy them myself. Right? So I did. I wanted those shoes, and I bought them. And they gave me blisters every time I wore them. Every stinking time. And so I only wore them like a half a dozen times. They gave me blisters galore. They hurt. They were stupid. I hated them. And I threw them in the closet and never saw them again. You know, isn't that so much like my life? I keep wanting that thing, and I get it, and I get blisters from it. It hurts me. It's destructive to me. I think I'm afraid that that's going to happen in a lot of people's lives as we pursue sin, and at the end of the day, you go, man, I didn't want that. It's not what I wanted. I didn't know it would do that. And there needs to be a place to come. There's hope and redemption and an answer to the brokenness of life. So I think that's what's going on here in chapter 3. Now, chapter 4, I'm going to call it this: Big Nebo's Difficult Journey. Sounds like Mr. Toad's, wild ride, if you've ever been to Disneyland. But I'm going to call this Big Nebo's Difficult Journey. Now, let's go there for a second. And the repetitive phrases that we covered last week, we had several of them. But we're going to go there again today a little bit, but they're going to be a little fewer. Today, what we're going to have is this. We're going to talk first about Nebuchadnezzar. We called him last week Big Nebo, so every time we get there today, he's going to be Big Nebo again. Okay, not meaning to be disrespectful, but it just makes it more fun. Secondly, we're going to have Daniel, whose Babylonian name is Belteshazzar. It's always hard to say, so I don't really like it. But in Daniel 1:4, let's just go there. In Daniel 1:4, it says, hey, bring some of the best of these captured nation of Israel. Bring some of the best to me, and we'll kind of get them involved. It says, used without blemish, of good appearance, and skilled in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, and learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace, and to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. Wow. I mean, bring me your best. And make sure that they're of good appearance. So handsome is what this means. Make sure they're handsome. So if we're going to call Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego the three amigos, then we've got to call Daniel El Guapo, because it means the handsome one. So we're going to call Daniel El Guapo in this. So just so you know. Then the third one we're going to talk about is the Most High God. Several times we're going to see the Most High God. And we are going to call him a name today, just so you know. We're going to call him something different than that when we get to that section. And this is what we're going to call him. We're going to call him the Awesome One. That's really what it means, the Awesome One. We use that word awesome a lot in our culture, right? Hey, that was awesome. Well, it wasn't awesome. It just means it was really good. That meal or that experience or whatever. There's really only one entity that really is awe-inspiring, and that is the God of the Scriptures, that he is the awesome one. And so when we get to the Most High God, we're going to call him the Awesome One this morning, okay? So let's start. Chapter 4, verse 1. Big Nebo. Okay, good job. Okay, we're going to go there one more time. Ready? Awesome. Verse 1, ready? Big Nebo. Okay, so we're going to find that Big Nebo is going to be kind of giving this message. This is either Daniel writing in the first person from Nebuchadnezzar's point of view, or he's involved Nebuchadnezzar or recording what Nebuchadnezzar did and said. One way or the other, Big Nebo to all peoples, nations, languages that dwell in all the earth. Wow. He feels like he's got a handle on the whole thing, right? I mean, he says, I'm the dude. I am Big Nebo. And he says, to the whole world, peace be multiplied to you. Wow, there's something going on. This is kind of a precursor, if you will. I think this really comes at the end of the story, but he's kind of starting it with that. He says, I want peace to be to you. Now look in verse 2. It seems good to me to show the signs and wonders of the Awesome One has done for me. The awesome one. What he had done in Nebuchadnezzar's life. He goes, man, I needed to tell all the things he had done. Look at this in verse 3. How great are his signs, how mighty his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom. His dominion endures from generation to generation. You see, Big Nebo was beginning to understand that God is sovereign over all empires and nations and people. And that kings come and go because he has sovereignty in this. And Nebo's beginning to understand that here. That he is understanding that God is awesome in everything he does. Wow. Look at this in verse 4. I was at ease in my house and prospering in my palace. Now he's going to start to tell the story of what happened. So he is hanging out in his house and things are going well. He's just having a good time. Hanging out, watching ESPN, probably Sports Center, and he's just relaxing. And everything's going well. And he's prospering in his palace. And he says, I saw a dream that made me afraid. As I lay in the bed, fancies and the visions of my head alarmed me. So I made a decree that all the wise men of Babylon should be brought before me, that they might make known to me the interpretation of the dream. Interesting here, before, when he had a dream, what did he ask for? Not only the interpretation, but the dream itself, right? And Daniel did both. Now he's going to make it easy. It's only half as difficult. I'm going to give you the dream, he says, but I need you to give me the interpretation. So let's go back. Verse 7. Then the magicians, the enchanters, the Chaldeans, and the astrologers came in, and I told them the dream. But they could not make known to me its interpretation. Wow, that's very interesting. These are all the guys that Daniel was in charge of, that he was over. Remember that in chapter 1? He said, hey, now you're in charge of all these guys, Daniel, because you're exceptional. You're amazing. And so he puts them in charge of all these guys. Now they came in, and they couldn't interpret it. Look at verse 8. At last, El Guapo, I love okay, you guys, let's try that again. I know it feels weird, but when you get to heaven and you call Daniel El Guapo, you got to give it some accent, and he'll just go, that's great. God is great. He's going to love it. Everybody else call him Daniel, but the questers will call him El Guapo. So at last came in before me he who was named Belteshazzar, after the name of my God. You see, he tried to make Daniel into his own God, a subservient of his own God. And that's why he named him that. Wow. But Daniel would have none of it. And he says, in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. Now, he understood something was different about Daniel. He didn't know it exactly yet, because he called him something about the spirit of the holy gods. Something unique's going on, but he couldn't identify it yet. And he says, I told him the dream, saying, Oh, El Guapo, chief of the magicians, because I know the spirit of the holy gods is in you, and that no mystery is too difficult for you, tell me the visions of my dream that I saw and their interpretation. And then he says, look, the visions of my head as I lay in bed were, and here now he begins to tell us it. Now listen to this. I saw, and behold, a tree in the midst of the earth, and its height was great. And the tree grew and became strong, and its top reached to heaven, and it was visible from the ends of the whole earth. That's a big tree, right? That's a pretty big tree. Its leaves were beautiful, and its fruit abundant, and it was food for all. The beasts of the field found shade under it, and the birds of the heavens lived in its branches, and all flesh was fed from it. Wow, that's cool. Now look in 13. I saw in the visions of my head that as I lay in bed, and behold, a watcher, a holy one, came down from heaven. He proclaimed aloud and said this, chop down the tree and lop off its branches, strip off its leaves and scatter its fruits. Let the beasts flee from under it and the birds from its branches, but leave the stump of its roots in the earth, bound with a band of iron and bronze, amidst the tender grass of the field. Let him be wet with the dew of heaven. Let his portion be with the beasts of the grass of the earth. Verse 16, let his mind be changed from a man's, and let a beast's mind be given to him, and let 7 periods of time pass before him. The sentence is by the decree of the watchers. This watcher that he saw, this unique person, this unique entity that came. And the decision by the word of the holy ones, to the end that the living may know that the awesome one rules the kingdom of men, and gives it to whom he will, and sets over it the lowliness of men. Wow, what a vision, right? You got to wonder, what in the world's going on? Now, let's look in verse 18. This dream I Big Nebo saw that you, O El Guapo, tell me the interpretation, because all the wise men of my kingdom are not able to make known to me the interpretation. Because all the wise men of my kingdom are not able to make known the interpretation, but you are able, for the spirit of the holy gods is in you. He knew something unique was going on, and he asked Daniel to help him. Now, look in verse 19. Then El Guapo, whose name was El Guapo, see, if we're consistent, it all works. Okay, so El Guapo was dismayed for a while, and his thoughts alarmed him. This was not easy for Daniel. It's not like he said, no problem, got it, and walks in boldly, arrogantly, pridefully. He doesn't walk in, he says, this is troubling to me. This is hard. I think what he began to understand is the interpretation, and he knew it was going to be difficult. This wasn't going to be an easy thing to say to Big Nebo. And so he's troubled by it at first. And the king answered and said, El Guapo, let not the dream or the interpretation alarm you. El Guapo answered and said, my Lord, may the dream be may be for those who hate you, and its interpretation for your enemies. What he's saying is this: I wish that the interpretation was applied to those who are against you. I wish I could say that, because what I'm going to say is not going to be fun. You are not going to like it. It's going to be very unsettling. I wish this was an interpretation against your enemy, but it's not. I wish it was. You get that? Don't you wish that sometimes what you understand spiritually, when you know it's going to be hard, don't you wish you could say it easier? Don't you wish you could please the people who ask you? Here's what's happening. He wishes he could please Big Nebo. He wishes he could make it easier, but he can't. Because look in verse 20 and 21, the tree that you saw, and he describes the tree again. And then in verse 22, he says, the tree, it's you. Big Nebo, it's you. It was a hard thing to say. This is the king who could tell the whole earth to listen. And he says, Nebuchadnezzar, Big Nebo, it's you. Whoa. Look at this in verse 23. And because Big Nebo saw a watcher, a holy one, coming down from heaven and saying, this is the interpretation, Big Nebo. It is a decree of the awesome one, which has come upon my lord the king. And you shall be driven from among men, and your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field, and you shall be made to eat the grass like an ox, and you shall be wet with the dew of heaven, and 7 periods of time shall pass before you. Let's stop there just for a second. So he says, what this tree is your kingdom. And it's served the people so well. It's been dominant and predominant in the whole world, and everyone's taking kind of shade in it. But God is going to come along, and he's going to lop it. He's going to knock it down. He's going to cut its leaves off. It's going to become non-existent. And you, Nebuchadnezzar, Big Nebo, you are going to be driven into the fields to act like an ox, to be a mess, into insanity is what really happens. And that's going to happen. And it'll happen for 7 periods of time. And we don't know exactly what those 7 periods of time are. Some would suggest, was it 7 hours? Probably longer than that. Was it 7 days? We don't know for sure. Was it 7 weeks, months, or years? Most would interpret it to mean 7 years. And in fact, that squares with history, that probably Nebuchadnezzar disappeared from ruling for 7 years. And he was in the fields, acting insanely, acting like an ox for 7 years. Wow. But it says that he'll stay there till, let's highlight it, till you know that the awesome one rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he will. Your pride has destroyed you, Nebuchadnezzar. And this has driven you into this crazy place until you know that it is the awesome one who rules the kingdom of men and gives it as he pleases. When you come to understand, it'll be amazing. Wow. Well, let's go to verse 26. And as it was commanded to leave the stump and roots of the tree, the kingdom shall be confirmed for you from the time that you know that heaven rules. He's saying this, I'll save it for you. That's what those bands around the stump meant. I'll save it for you. When and if you come to a realization of who God is, I'll save it for you. It'll be there when you get back. Well, and in fact, it even gets better. But look at this. From the time that heaven rules, and then in verse 27, therefore, Big Nebo, let my counsel be acceptable to you. Because before he said, I wish I could give this for your enemy, right? I wish I could please you, but I can't. The interpretation is that this tree is you and your kingdom. This is going to be you, that it drives into insanity. So then he says, well, I've told you the truth here, Big Nebo, so let my counsel be acceptable to you. And then he says this, he drives it home. Look at these, look at this. Break off your sins by practicing righteousness. He called him to action. He called him to do something with it. He said, you've been so full of yourself, Big Nebo. It's been all about you so far. You have dallied with God, but you have really gone back to saying, I'm in charge, it's my life, I'll do what I want, it's my kingdom, I'll do what I like. And it's not about anybody else, not about God, it's about me. And so here we find Daniel. Can you imagine saying to the king of Babylon? He says, I want you to break off your sins by practicing righteousness and break off your iniquities by showing mercy to the oppressed, the very people he's oppressed. Wow. And there may perhaps be a lengthening of your prosperity. And he's saying, Nebo, I'll save this for you. But if you come to understand who I am, I'll restore this to you. And I'm going to extend your prosperity out of my grace, but you need to know where it comes from. It doesn't come from you. It comes from me. Wow. Now, we're not going to read it, but in the next verses, 28 through 33, it talks about Nebuchadnezzar's humiliation. It talks about his time, those 7 years, wandering around like an ox, eating the grass, living outside, dew falling on him. It's a mess. It's a horrible experience for 7 years. And then, though, when we get to chapter 2, verse 34, it says this. At the end of the days, at the end of those 7 years, Big Nebo, he says, I lifted my eyes to the heavens and my reason returned to me, and I blessed the awesome one and praised and honored him who lives forever. For his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing, and he does according to his will among the host of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth, and none can stay his hand or say to him, what in the world are you doing? What have you done? They can't say it because they understand that he is a sovereign God. So you guys, I don't know about you this week, but you probably wondered, what in the world are you doing, God? Are you kidding? Somehow God is still in charge. I had to think this week, the scripture, that his mercies are new every morning. It didn't go away this week, just so you know. God did not wring his hands in heaven and act afraid. God is not afraid of anything. God is still in charge. Doesn't mean that we all cooperate, doesn't mean that everything that happens here is great, but God didn't freak out this week. His mercies were new again every morning. That in the midst of a place that's very dark, he is light. You know, if we were going to turn off all the lights in this room and close the door, it would get really dark. Have you been in here when it's dark? It's really dark in this room. And here's the deal. You and I have been given the privilege of holding a flashlight. And when you have a flashlight in a totally dark place, you become a place of hope. You become a place that can help people find the door. You become hope in the hands of God, because that's what he's like. He's light in the midst of darkness. We can't say, what are you doing? You're out of control. You've messed it up. It doesn't happen that way. Look in verse 36. At the same time, my reason returned to me, and for the glory of my kingdom, my majesty and splendor returned to me. My counselors and my Lord sought me, and I have established in my kingdom, and still more greatness was added to me. God restored him. That's amazing. And then verse 37, it will kind of end with this. It's amazing. And now Big Nebo. Now listen to this. You guys, he does two things. Listen, this is incredible. praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, for all his works are right and his ways are just. All his works are right and his ways are just. You can trust me, he says. And Nebo says, I'm going to trust you. I know I have sort of kind of before, but this has been a journey for me. It's been a difficult journey for him. In fact, in this verse is the last time we'll hear of Nebuchadnezzar in the book of Daniel. He disappears. He's taken over by successive rulers in the Babylon, and eventually he's going to be taken over by the Medes and the Persians. This is it. This is where we leave him, right here. And it says this, and now I, Big Nebo, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven. And all his works are right and his ways are just. Wow. And look at what he says here. And those who walk in pride, he is able to humble. That he is able to do that. You see, what God did in Nebo's life was to bring him to a place where he had to understand who he was and who God was, not the other way around. Wow. So we got to ask the question, what do we do as a result? Let me just throw a few thoughts out. What do we do from this chapter? What do we do with our lives? What do we do in the midst of the world that we live in today with the things that are going on? Here's the first thought, observation I have, is that sometimes coming to faith is a process, right? Big Nebo it was a process. He engaged it, and then he walked away. He kind of was prideful, and then God would humble him. And then he'd say, yes, you're right, and he would do it. And then eventually, it took a 7-year period. Sometimes coming to faith is a process. It's done gradually as we watch God unfold life around us and see his hand in the life of other people. Sometimes coming to faith is a gradual process. God was patient with Nebuchadnezzar, wasn't he? He was far more patient with him than I would be. I'd have said, hey, knucklehead, I've shown you. How many times do I have to show you? You know? But God kept working in Nebuchadnezzar's life, kept using all these guys, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, the three amigos. He uses El Guapo in his life. And he just begins to draw Big Nebo to himself. And at this point, we never see him again. So I have to stop and say, this is where he ended. That's a great place to end, right? By honoring and extolling God and understanding God can bring those who are prideful to humility. He understood who God was. Wow. Sometimes it takes that for people. Some of the people that we've seen on TV this past week who have been the most vehement against it, I believe someday will be the ones who are most vehemently for the incredible work of the awesome one. It's the way God works. Wow. Secondly, without God, we settle for things that actually damage and destroy. You see, Nebuchadnezzar was bent on destruction. He thought he was built on something else, but he was bent on destruction. And without God, we settle. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, we'll just do it backwards. It's okay. Without God, we settle for things that actually damage and destroy. And before that, I meant to say, sometimes our pride prevents us from experiencing the life we were created for. Have you ever felt that in your own life? I have. My pride prevents me. I think I want life, and I want it on my terms. And every time I get to the end of that, it is a destruction. And it prevents me from really experiencing what God wanted for me. That's what happened in Nebo's life. Okay, let's go to the next one. Let me just ask us this. What sins do we need to break off so we can practice righteousness? It's what Daniel encouraged Nebo to do. I'm sorry, it's what El Guapo asked Nebo to do. I can't even remember my own terms. What do you need to break off in order to practice righteousness? What do we need to do? You see, the change in America is not going to happen out there. It's going to start here. It's going to start with us. We have to confess our sin. We have to repent from our ways, the things that we've done. That's where it'll start. Not with them. It'll start with us. That we take responsibility for the own sin in our lives. What do we need to break off from so that we can practice righteousness? Wow. Or the second question that he brought up, what iniquities do we need to reject in order to care for the oppressed? Care for those who are oppressed in this world. What do we need to do? I think like no other time that I know of in American history, this is going to be true today. That we have a challenge ahead of us. And we cannot back away from it. We cannot give it up. We have to face it head on. But we're going to start by breaking away from our own sins and practicing righteousness, that we will break away from the iniquities that have held us back from serving the oppressed. Wow. Let me ask you this too. Let me just an observation. Praise and honor is the language of the life of the people of the awesome one. Praise and honor. God is not defeated. God is awesome in every way. Praise and honor are the language and the life of his people. So in a few minutes here, we're going to sing. In fact, band, why don't you guys come up? We're going to sing because we're going to honor him for who he is. We're going to love him for who he is and allow him to fill us in every way. So praise and honor is the language and the life of the people of the awesome one. And then pride comes before destruction. It does. Scriptures say that. It's true. Pride comes before destruction. Humility paves the way to influence. I believe that in our culture, that our biggest influence is going to be from our humility and our brokenness, not from our arrogance or our pride. And when we humble ourselves, we understand the brokenness of our own lives, and let God deal with those, that he will carve out a place for us to deal with a broken world and broken people. And it won't be from the fact that we'll stand up and say, we're great. It's going to say that we're lost too, and all I have is a flashlight, and I'm willing to share it with you. I'm willing to have you come do it together. And last but not least, here's the deal. Big Nebo's difficult journey is not dissimilar from ours, is it? We've all been on that same road doing the same things. And God in his grace showed up and restores us to the life he's called us to. And he'd like to do that restoration in the lives of every man, woman, and child on planet Earth. That's the beauty of who he is, right? So here's what I'd like us to do is I'd like us just to spend some time worshiping him. In a broken world, we have an awesome God. He is the awesome one. And he calls us in our hearts to be with him. And so I just want the band, they're going to lead us through a time of just worshiping who he is. Because when we walk out today, he is still an awesome one. He's the awesome God that we can trust. So, band.
Thanks. Let's stay seated for just a few minutes as we get ready to sing. I want to kind of take us through a time of prayer. I just want to ask the question, what crowns do we have that are built on pride? What crowns do we come in with that we maybe were denying that we had? What crowns the last week did we have on our heads as we kind of looked at what was happening? And if it's true that our pride keeps us from getting to the place that we're supposed to get to and where God wants us to go, I want us to spend some time going to him and laying those crowns before him and saying, this is what I had. This is what wasn't honoring to you. This is where I want to go. So take just a minute and talk to the Lord about where you have been this weekend in your own pride. Father, as we lay our crowns before you, we recognize that there's a need and we have a responsibility for praying for those around us, both those that we love and that we call our friends, and those that persecute us as well. And maybe we think that those are the people that are causing us to have this prideful response. God, we pray for those that persecute us and those that are filled with contempt. We take a moment to pray for someone this morning that has rubbed us the wrong way and that we are rejecting that relationship because our pride is in the way. And God, as a community of people, we want to lift each other up. We want to think of those around us that we love, that are hurting, that are going through times that are tough, that are our friends and neighbors, our family, those that are in this room. God, we lift someone up that we've had on our hearts this week as well. And God, in that responsibility that we have that we've talked about as well, we also have an opportunity that's more open-ended, and that's in our response to you. And that's personal for each of us, but we choose to come together as a community of people and respond together. And we thank you for being sovereign. We thank you for being in control of the universe at all times, and not just when things seem to be sailing along smoothly, but we thank you in all circumstances. And this week, these circumstances are chaos. We thank you for still being in control. And as we stand together, God, our response to you is that we lay our crowns at your feet and we fall down to worship you. And sometimes in the most simple of words and gestures, with words being few here, our response to you, as simple as it is all you're asking of us. We thank you for bringing us here this morning.